Darth Pedro has a cool random number library that's available as a Nuget package, and he made a pull request to the code on GitHub that changes the SOS CSRPG code to use his Nuget package. So we're going to go over the changes for that in this lesson. Something to note, we also updated the version of .NET to 4.72. To implement these changes, if you don't want to just pull down the latest source code from GitHub, we'll start by opening the solution in Visual Studio, and then we need to go to Nuget. Just right-click on your solution, select Manage Nuget Packages for Solutions, and then you'll go to the Browse link. I'm going to the Installed since I've already installed the packages, but you want to search for these two packages, d20tek.common.net47 and d20tek.dicenotation.net47. And you're going to add those to the engine project. Once those are included in the solution, we need to go through and make changes to about 10 or so files to handle the new library. The first thing we'll do is in our services, we're going to go to a new dice service class. And if you notice, this implements the iDice service interface, which is another new file we need to add. And this dice service is going to replace our random number generator static class. It uses a singleton pattern. Notice we have a private constructor for dice service, and the way you access it is by calling diceservice.instance and then .role or whatever function you want to do on the dice server service. There are several configuration options in here, but we're going to focus on the role function that's in line 56, or the one that's on lines 58 through 64 that takes some different parameters. These are the functions where we can pass in, here on line 58, the number of sides a die has, how many times we want to roll or how many dice we want to roll. So if we want to roll 3 6-sided dice, we'd pass in 6 and then 3. And then a modifier if we want to do like a 2 dice 6 plus 1, which is a common, 2d6 plus 1 is a common notation in Dungeons and Dragons and games like that. We can also call it in line 56, basically the same function, but passing in the string notation. When you add the dice service class, remember to add the iDice service interface, which is just the structure, kind of the public things that the dice service class has to have. We don't really need an iDice service interface for our program, but this is nice to have if we ever want to write some unit tests around a dice service, because our unit test, you always have an expected input and an expected output. And if we have a real random number generator in our unit test, we can't consistently know what the input's going to be. Like for instance, if we want to test our attack a monster code, there's a chance you'll hit the monster or there's a chance you'll miss. And if we have the real random number code, we don't know what's going to happen. But if we just implement a mock iDice service, then we can pass that into our combat code, and we can say, well, for this test, go ahead and pretend like you successfully hit the monster. And for this test, pretend like you missed the monster. So we can have our unit test be consistent. That's where we'd normally use something like this iDice service interface. Although I will add, it gets a little trickier since this is for a static class. It can still be done. I don't know if we'll ever do that, but just something to keep in mind. The next step, now that we have the dice service class, we can delete the random number generator class. Don't have anything to show you here since it's deleted, but just go ahead and delete that out of the engine project. Now we need to go into the rest of our code that has any random number calls and change it to use the new dice service. We'll go into the location class. The first thing we need to do is add in a using engine services. Before, the random number generator class was just at the top level of the project, so we didn't need a using directive. Here, since it's in the services, we now need to add this one. And then we're going to go down to line 66 and change our random number generator the one that determines what type of monster shows up, to use the dice service instance roll. Total chance is 1. And this will get us the random number value so we can determine which monster out of the monsters here list is going to appear. Next, we'll go into the monster class and do the same type of thing. We need to add a using directive for the engine services up at the top. And then we'll go down to line 50 and change our code here that determined if the loot item appears on the monster or not, to use the new dice service. Dice service instance roll 100, and check to see if that number is less than or equal to the percentage of the probability that the item appears. Something you might notice, a couple things. I've changed my display, my color theme of Visual Studio, so it's a dark background. I think this is a little bit easier to look at if you're working for hours and hours. Let me know if that causes any problems in the videos. And you may also notice this less than or equal looks a little weird. Before it was two separate signs. It was the equal sign and the less than sign. Now it's got this weird shape. This is called a ligature. Some fonts use ligatures and they combine multiple character things into one character, like here less than an equal or greater than an equal or not equal to. That's just part of the color theme I'm using. Doesn't change anything with the code, just looks a little different when you're viewing it. The next class we need to go into is the game session class. And here on line 136, when we determine the player's random dexterity, we need to change that to use our dice service instance roll. Here passing in a 6 for the 6-sided die and the 3 for 3 times, like rolling 3 6-sided dice. Then we'll go into the engine actions attack with weapon class. This is where we determine how much damage the weapon did. And since our data is going to use this new dice notation, we need to have that available inside the attack with weapon code. First, I'll point out here, this is our not equal ligature. Before it used to be an exclamation point and an equal sign, and now it's displayed as this. I think it's a little bit cleaner. If everybody hates it, leave a message, leave a comment, and I can change the font. It's not a big problem. And what we do in the attack with weapon class, we used to have 2 variables here. They were integer variables for the minimum damage and the maximum damage. Now we're going to have a string that's going to hold the damage dice. So this will hold like a string of 1d4 plus 2. If we wanted to say the amount of damage a weapon does is 1 4-sided dice plus 2. And we need to change on line 11 the attack with weapon constructor to now take in a string of damage dice. This is the damage dice notation. This used to take in the minimum damage and maximum damage integers. Now it will be the dice notation, which we're going to get out of the data file, which we'll change in a minute. Then on lines 19 through 25, we're going to take out the old parameter checking for the integer values and replace it with this new parameter check, just making sure that the damage dice value passed in is not an empty string. And then finally, inside the execute function, when we determine the amount of damage on line 34, we're going to replace the old random number generator call with the new dice service call to get the value based on whatever that dice notation for the weapon was. Since we changed the constructor for the attack with weapon class, and we have some unit tests for it, we need to go into the test attack with weapon and change wherever we instantiate a new attack with weapon object. This one now will change it from, instead of passing in an integer minimum damage and an integer maximum damage, we're going to pass in something like this, 1d5. That's on line 17, on line 30, and on line 41, we need to change the values passed in for the damage. Now we're going to change the item factory class because we're going to have to change the gameitems.xml so the weapon damage will have a dice notation instead of the 2 minimum damage and maximum damage attributes. And this factory that builds the objects, the weapon objects, is going to need to read the new attribute and pass that into the new constructor for weapon for the game item. We'll do that on lines 65 and 67, where we read in the nodes for the weapons. And before, when we instantiated the attack with weapon object, we used to pass in the node attribute string minimum damage and maximum damage. Now, since the attack with weapon takes in that dice notation, we're going to pass in node attribute string damage dice. That's how we get the damage into the attack with weapon. And of course, we'll have to go into gameitems.xml and change all of our weapons. Instead of having a minimum damage and maximum damage attribute, we're now going to have just one damage dice attribute with the dice notation. And we need to do that for all the weapons on line 4 through 8. And the final code change is to go into the Engine Services Combat Service and change it to use the new dice service instead of the random number generator class. So on lines 20, 23, 36, and 39, we're going to change all of our random number generator code to call dice service instance role instead. There is one additional change we made, and it's not to the code, but in the solution, we created a new docs folder. You can just right-click on the solution and do add new solution folder and name it docs. And then we created this text file, licensesconsumed.md. Since we're using some additional libraries here, like the dice notation one, which is under the MIT license, and newtonsoft.json, which is also under the MIT license, part of the MIT license is that we include the individual library's copy of the license, so that we are kind of admitting or stating that we're using this other source code. We're using these other libraries. That's the polite thing to do, and it's also the legal thing to do. If you're just building this and playing this on your own computer, nobody's ever going to care. But if you ever release this and give this out to your friends, you want to make sure that your licenses are up to date and that you're legal. And also, it's, people put time and effort into open source projects. It's good to show them appreciation and respect. And with all that, we should be able to start the game and go fight a giant snake. We've missed. The snake hit us for a certain amount of random damage. This time we randomly hit the snake and the snake randomly missed us. So it looks like the random number generator is working. As always, if you're watching the video on YouTube, in the description below the video there'll be links to the support page, to the source code on GitHub, to the Discord channel if you have questions and want to ask there. If you're watching this on my site, scottlilly.com, you'll be able to leave a comment below the lesson post. So if you do have questions, let me know and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. I've actually got a lot more free time now since my last project ended for my client, and there aren't that many new projects happening. So hopefully talk to you again soon.